Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inquirer Live at Gameday Central alongside EJ Smith. I am Olivia Reiner. We are coming at you live from M&T Bank Stadium, getting set for the Bird Bowl, the Eagles matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. EJ, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Olivia. I tested out my hamstring before the show. Went through a rigorous, calisthenics routine, and I'm feeling good for the show. I think I'm ready to go. So yeah, excited for the show, excited for the game.
I'm glad you're feeling good. However, there's someone on the Eagles who is not. We are going to get into that in just a moment. However, before we start our show today, just a reminder, you can be a part of our conversation. You can head on over to inquire.com/Eagles Game Day. Leave us a question, a comment, whatever is on your mind. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll take some of your questions toward the end of our show today. All right, EJ, we've got a lot to discuss and some breaking news regarding the health of this Eagles team. DeVonta Smith is out for today's game, dealing with a hamstring injury. He was out here earlier on the field going through some workouts. However, it was notable that he was never at any point being evaluated, at least as far as we could tell from out here. Usually when we're up in the press box, we see general manager Howie Roseman down on the field. We see the player being surrounded by some trainers. This time it was just DeVonta going through some workouts. Regardless, gave it a go, saw if he could maybe get it out there today, and alas, he is unable to play. So that's a major loss for the Eagles receiving core. In addition to Smith not being able to play, Darius Slay is out. He had been ruled out going into today's game as he sustained a concussion about the Rams. Van Sumeren sustained a season-ending knee injury and has been placed on injured reserve in practice on Friday. And then Johnny Wilson dealing with a hamstring injury that he sustained in practice as well on Friday, or at least on Thursday, perhaps. We don't know, but he did not practice on Friday, and he is out for today's game. So this is a really long list of inactives. EJ, what stands out to you about some of these big losses for the Eagles?
Yeah, I think it really has to start with DeVonta Smith. It really changes the way that defenses can present to the Eagles offense. When DeVonta Smith's not out there, secondaries can kind of tilt more toward AJ Brown. We'll see more double teams as a result of DeVonta not being in the lineup. Obviously, they've been successful without him in the lineup at points this season. Last Sunday against the Rams, even AJ Brown had over 100 receiving yards. Despite DeVonta being out of the lineup. But yeah, I do think that his absence will be felt in the passing game for sure.
Absolutely. And then Slay being out, we're expecting to see Isaiah Rodgers start opposite Quinyon Mitchell at outside cornerback. We saw a little bit of Rodgers this past week. He came in when Slay was injured against the Rams, and then we saw him maybe struggle here and there. He did make a big play. He forced a fumble early in the game that set the tone and helped the Eagles continue to pull away with a lead. That said, he has played throughout the season, has had some highs, has had some lows. How confident are you in Rodgers if he is the one to start to get the job done here today?
Yeah, I think you could be reasonably confident. He's played a lot of football for the Eagles and also before, in his tenure with the Indianapolis Colts. I think, yeah, he has not maybe been as reliable. I mean, even Darius Slay hasn't been reliable for parts of this season. So, yeah, I think you can be reasonably confident in his ability to kind of hold up in coverage. Maybe it does kind of change the complexion for the secondary a little bit. But again, they've played a lot with him this season. Darius Slay has kind of been in and out of the lineup. Obviously, to no fault of his own with the concussion here. But, yeah, they have had a lot of reps with Isaiah Rodgers on that outside cornerback spot opposite Quinyon Mitchell. So I think we at least know what it looks like. It's not like this is a cornerback that we haven't seen play, some important downs for the Eagles this season.
We've seen Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean kind of not get picked on as often in recent weeks as they continue to grow and ascend and establish names for themselves in this league. Perhaps Lamar Jackson will opt to try to pick on Isaiah Rodgers a little bit. We'll see how the game shakes out. So that's who's not playing in today's game. Who is playing? So a few names here. Paris Campbell was signed to the active roster on Saturday in place of Van Sumeren. He takes his spot on the active roster. We're going to expect to see some of Campbell today, considering the fact that Smith is out and so is Johnny Wilson. And in addition to Campbell now being on the active roster, Chuck Harris, who the Eagles claimed off of waivers from the Carolina Panthers earlier this week, a defensive end expected to assume some sort of role. We'll see exactly. I'm kind of curious, EJ, you spoke to Harris in the wake of Brandon Graham going on season-ending injured reserve after tearing his triceps against the Los Angeles Rams. Harris now in the building, going from the lowly Carolina Panthers to the Philadelphia Eagles. First of all, what was his reaction to joining this team? And also, what does he expect in terms of his efforts, his contributions early on in his Eagles tenure here, starting with today's game?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say his reaction was enthusiasm. We asked him what he knew about the Eagles, and he said that they're a playoff, contender. They're a team that has aspirations to go to the Super Bowl, and that's really all he needed to know. Going from a team in the Carolina Panthers that are kind of, in the final stretch of their season, not really contending for the playoffs. He said that the morale difference between the Panthers and the Eagles roster was noticeable, right away. So I think that he does see it as an opportunity to kind of, play late into January, or, at least make it into the postseason. As far as his role goes, I'm curious to see how much he is used today. Vic Fangio kind of alluded to the fact that he didn't really see much of Harris's tape before he signed with the Eagles, or before he was claimed by the Eagles. So, I think that it's important to note that edge rushers don't have that many, that much of a variety of responsibilities. It's not like we're talking about, a safety or an inside linebacker. Vic Fangio has said in the past that, those positions are harder to sort of onboard somebody, mid-season, before the trade deadline. He mentioned that. I think that, edge rusher is a little bit more straightforward. And, Chuck Harris kind of acknowledged that as well. He said edge is edge. There's only so many different jobs that you're going to have in the framework of a defense. So I don't think it's necessarily a matter of him not knowing the calls or him not knowing the scheme well enough to, really kind of integrate quickly. I think it's just a matter of if they feel comfortable with him out there and how much they feel comfortable with him out there. I think that Brandon Graham's absence is mostly going to be filled by Nolan Smith and Jalix Hunt taking on more of a role in the edge rusher rotation. But I think it's definitely something to keep an eye out how much Chuck Harris plays, after, joining the team a couple of days ago, really.
It is notable that Vic Fangio, when asked about it earlier this week, he did hint at the fact that Jalix Hunt and Nolan Smith could stand to take on a few more snaps. Josh Sweat, maybe not so much. His snap count has been down relative to last season, and yet he has still been more productive. So I'm sure the Eagles would like to keep things that way if they can. All right, in addition to Campbell and Harris being active today, Sidney Brown had been questionable going into today's game with a knee injury. So the Eagles get one of their core special teamers active for today's game, and then a couple of practice squad elevations. CJ Uzoma, once again, the third tight end on the roster, and then a new one, inside linebacker O'Shawn Mathis, is slated to play. He's active for today's game, expected to contribute on special teams. For the Ravens, now they're dealing with some injuries as well. Defensive tackle Michael Pierce, who had his 21-day practice window was opened earlier this week. He has been on injured reserve with a calf injury, but he was not activated in time for today's game, so he is out. And then outside linebacker Kyle Van Noy has been dealing with a hamstring and a neck injury. He was doubtful going into today's game, and he has also been rolled out. So two pretty substantial losses there for the Ravens. And then linebacker Roquan Smith is active for today's game. He had been dealing with a hamstring injury throughout the week. However, he was removed from the injury report after Friday and was considered good to go. So couple little updates there. All right, let's transition into some of the latest headlines, the big storylines going into, again, the Bird Bowl. I love, I'm always into the animals, the animal teams that the Eagles play against. This is going to be, I think if you're a football fan, this is an exciting game because it's featuring a head-to-head matchup between two of the top running backs in the league in Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry. Now, if you watched the game last week against the Los Angeles Rams, you saw that Saquon Barkley had an incredible day on the ground. He had a career best 255 rushing yard day against the Rams. Now, on the flip side, the Ravens defense has been really, really stout against the run. They've only allowed 77.9 rushing yards per game, which is second in the league. They've given up just 16 runs of 10 plus yards, which is the league low. Now, EJ, the Eagles most likely don't want to abandon the run game. They don't want to try to take Saquon Barkley out of this if they don't have to. What is the key to getting him going against one of the top defenses in the league?
Yeah, I think you said it right there. I think that a big part of it's going to be sticking with it, not getting impatient. We've seen the Eagles be relatively patient with the run game so far this season. It's not necessarily something that you come to expect from Kellen Moore, from what we've heard of him, at his previous stops, but it's definitely been the case this season that even if the running game doesn't get going early on, I think that they have been able to be patient with it, maybe introduce some different types of runs. Maybe they'll go from gap scheme runs to zone runs, or kind of the other way around sometimes. We've seen them do that at points this season. So I think sticking with it's going to be an important part, but that's a double-edged sword. You can't stick with it too much. Like you mentioned, the Ravens, these are two of the best teams in the NFL. The Ravens, have an opportunity to get out to an early lead, especially if the Eagles are, slow to start, and especially in the running game. So, it's kind of finding that balance. I think they've done well finding that balance for most of the season. I think it's also important to note, like, the Eagles have had success against, top-rated run defenses in the past. Last year they did really well against the Minnesota Vikings early in the season, and the Vikings ended the season as one of the top 5 run defenses in the NFL. And I remember in 2021 there was a lot made of the team's matchup against the New Orleans Saints, because they were this big vaunted run defense, and the Eagles ran all over them too. And I think that the Eagles run game is unique in a sense because of Jalen Hurts' ability to be +1 in the run game, kind of stress the back end of a defense, and also just obviously the Eagles offensive line. Sometimes those matchups, even if they're not favorable for most teams, they can still be favorable for the Eagles. So I think that there is a chance for them to run the ball. I know this Ravens front is really talented. I do think that I've seen this Eagles offense have success against good run defenses enough to think that they still have a chance, if they stick with it, to find some success on the ground for sure.
EJ, you called the Eagles' run game unique. I think you could even go as far as to say that the Ravens have a pretty unique run game too. Derrick Henry ranks second in the league in rushing yards behind Saquon Barkley with 1,325 yards. And then, of course, the Ravens also have the threat of quarterback Lamar Jackson on the ground. And according to Next Gen Stats, he is on pace to be the first player in the Super Bowl era to lead all quarterbacks in, get this, passing yards, passing touchdowns, and rushing yards in the same season, which is quite mind-blowing. The Eagles have really cleaned up their run defense in recent weeks coming out of the bye week. Not only have they limited missed tackles, I would say just their fundamentals all around have been far improved over their first 4 games of the season. How do you feel like Vic Fangio might approach attempting to slow down Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry on the ground, while also keeping in mind that the Ravens boast a really talented receiving core as well?
Yeah, I think it'll start with probably continuing to use Zach Bond as the tack-on edge defender at times. To be able to switch to those 5-man fronts where you maybe present 4 down at the beginning of the play, and like just before the snap, Bond can walk down and they can kind of change the alignments from there. I think that that's been really important for them for being able to kind of improve their run defense from earlier in the season. And I think tackling is going to be a really big thing. The Eagles have tackled a lot better since the bye week. Early in the season it was a major concern for this defense. They've been noticed just like significantly better at getting guys on the ground with the first effort or the second effort. Missed tackles against this team. Obviously, like, the Ravens are going to break tackles. Listen, like, Lamar Jackson has the ability to kind of make other professional athletes look not like professional athletes in a way that is pretty special. And obviously we've seen the Eagles guys have success doing exactly that. Derrick Henry's another one who can do that. So it's going to be a real challenge. And I really do. I think the tackling is going to be important for them, and kind of being like like you mentioned, the Fangio aspect of it all. I think kind of mixing up the fronts is going to be important at times. And again, having Bond be that player that is sometimes like, you always hear, the Eagles offense will talk about, oh, we have to identify where this guy is every down. And I know that Zach Bond maybe isn't that, caliber of player necessarily, but the fact that he has so much versatility to line up in different alignments, I think that can be, the Eagles can find success doing that, kind of making it so that the Ravens constantly have to find Zach Bond, figure out where he's aligned and kind of go from there.
Bond has been playing at a super, super high level. Be very curious to see how he fares in today's game. I want to switch it back over to the Ravens defense. They, as we've already discussed, have a really strong run defense. However, they have struggled a little bit in coverage, particularly cornerback Brandon Stephens. He has been targeted 75 times in coverage, which is the 3rd most in the NFL, and he has averaged 9.2 yards per target, which is the 9th most in the league. And then in addition to that, the Ravens, just as a defense in total, have allowed a league most 94 explosive pass plays this season, of explosive being defined as 15 yards or greater. And they have the 2nd highest explosive pass rate allowed in the NFL at 17.7%. If AJ Brown is anywhere near me right now, and I know he's not, but if he was, perhaps his ears would perk up a little bit, because he and Jalen Hurts have had a really impressive connection on those downfield passes, particularly outside the numbers on those go balls. We have seen it time and time again this season. Perhaps this is another opportunity for them to take advantage of that, but then you have to consider the fact that Devontae Smith is out today. So even though the Ravens are maybe struggling a little bit in the secondary right now, is this potentially an opportunity for the Eagles to take advantage of some of those issues, even without Devontae Smith?
Yeah, when you think about the premium that the Eagles put on explosive plays, I definitely think that there should be opportunities. I think they'll take those opportunities. It's interesting because Jalen Hurts hasn't thrown the ball more than 30 times in a game since the bye week. He's had, somewhere between 20, 25, maybe like high 20s for, pretty much again since the bye week. That's been the case. So I don't know if they're necessarily going to air it out. I think they really have leaned into this run first identity, running in neutral downs, running on early downs, really kind of leaning into that. But I mean, at the same time, we've seen them kind of, complement that consistent running game with shots down the field. I think this is the type of game where you can, we've earlier in the season we were critical of how often they took, shots outside the numbers down the sidelines. I think this is a game where you can kind of take some of those, especially if AJ Brown has favorable matchups. I don't know how many favorable matchups he'll get without Devontae Smith, like we mentioned earlier in the show, but there will be opportunities, and when they have those opportunities, I definitely think it'll be really important for them to try to capitalize on that. Because like you mentioned, it's like you can't run your head against a brick wall, constantly throughout this game. The Ravens have been susceptible in the secondary, so I think it's going to be an interesting cat and mouse game. It's like, do you stick with your strength, or do you kind of try and play to their weakness?
Sounds painful. Wouldn't want to run my head against a brick wall either. All right, let's transition into my favorite segment. We love hearing from all of you over on Inquirer.com/Eagles Game Day. Let's take some of your questions and your comments right now. We'll start with this one from R. Chang. They say that it is going to be interesting to see the Eagles' approach because the run game generally hasn't been impressive in the first quarter. It takes some time to gel, figure out the opposition's defense, and then wear them down. I asked Saquon Barkley about this a couple weeks ago because I believe he leads the league certainly in explosive runs in the second half. I think he also leads the league in yards over expected, rushing yards over expected in the second half as well. So you have someone here who continues to get better as the game goes on, and he says that it's just how he trains really, and he trains in the offseason to be able to get better as the game goes on, and perhaps opposing defenses maybe start to get worn down a little bit. Do you expect to see the run game continue on that trend of heating up as the game goes on, or is there a way for the Eagles? Do they have a desire to really stick it to them and punch them in the mouth right off the bat?
Yeah, I just think in general, the Eagles' first quarter scoring is still really low. I think that their first quarter production is still, pretty low. So I think no matter what they do, they're probably going to have to stay patient and stick with it. But that is one of these like lingering questions. Obviously they've been on a great streak here. They played really well since the bye week. But there are a few things, and I think that the early game production it's still kind of one of those things because that can really change the complexion of a game, especially against an offense as good as Baltimore. Is like, if they can get out to an early lead, all of a sudden it is harder to stick with the run. We've talked about, how patient they've been. Like the part of the contributing factor for them being able to be patient is the fact that the games have stayed close in that early going. So, I think that, it's a good question. Like, how can they figure out those first couple series, like getting points on the board to make sure that the game stays in a neutral state so they aren't chasing it?
For that comment. Well, let's take this one here from Skip D. They say Ben Van Sumeren seemed to be helping the run game, and it is a shame for a young player who was carving out a role in the NFL. Ben Van Sumeren had evolved from a depth undrafted free agent inside linebacker to a fullback who was getting on the field only roughly, I would say, a maximum of 5 snaps per game on offense. However, when he was on the field, he was making an impact, particularly as a lead blocker for Saquon Barkley. And now he is out of the picture, out of the lineup. It'll be interesting to see if they use perhaps a tight end in that fullback role in the absence of Van Sumeren. But when you heard that he had sustained that season-ending knee injury on Friday in practice, what was your reaction to the future of not only Van Sumeren and his ability to have a role on this team of any kind, but also just the run game in general and where it might need to evolve without him?
Yeah, I mean, you're disappointed for him, obviously, especially I felt like there was a pass coming his way in the coming weeks at some point. So, yeah, definitely disappointing for him. I mean, as far as like how the Eagles offense is impacted, I mean, that fullback package obviously wasn't a major part of the run game, but I think it was an important wrinkle, especially in that under center run game that they've been evolving throughout the season. I think you mentioned it, like, the tight end room, I think is probably going to have to take some of those snaps. I think CJ Uzoma makes sense. He's probably their best blocking tight end. Maybe isn't saying the most, considering the guys that are ahead of him aren't great in the run game most of the time. But I think that Uzoma can kind of fill that role as like that, fullback in a pinch. So yeah, I agree with the commenter though. I think it's a meaningful loss for the offense. It's kind of ironic to say that about a linebacker, full-time linebacker, but he did have an important, like I said, he had an important role kind of as a changeup in the run game.
Thank you, Skip D, for your comment. Let's take this one from T Chili. They say that they love their Eagles, but unless Jalen Hurts can throw the ball successfully downfield, the Ravens would win this game. That they don't see the Eagles running all over the Ravens. EJ, we already kind of mentioned this, but what do you feel like the state of the passing game is right now with Jalen Hurts at the helm, especially since seeing as coming out of the bye week, the Eagles have taken really a run-first approach. Saquon Barkley shouldering a really substantial workload. I think we've had questions throughout the season, is this going to be sustainable? Yet it has continued to work for them. Do you feel like if the Eagles need to air it out today, that they can win that way?
I'm going to be honest and say I don't know. I think that we're at a point in the season where we know a lot about this Eagles team. We kind of have a really good sense of their ceiling. Then I think we have a pretty good sense of their floor as well. I think that one of the biggest things that's going to define that ceiling that we still are not sure of is quite how it's going to look if they do need to drop back 40 plus times a game. We haven't seen them do that. Like I mentioned, Jalen Hurts hasn't thrown more than 30 passing attempts since the bye week. We saw how it looked earlier in the season when he had to throw the ball, drop back and throw the ball a lot. It didn't look great. There were times where the offense was very, the word I keep using is arrhythmic. The passing game has been that way for most of the season. So I think that it is a real question. I think that these games are going to be the types of games where you can learn a little bit about that. I think these are important tests. I think that if it goes well, you go into the playoffs knowing that they can do it a little bit. You have a little bit more confidence knowing that they can do it against a team like the Baltimore Ravens. So yeah, no, I mean it's a legitimate question. It's honestly one of the biggest lingering questions, going into this postseason stretch.
And I'll be honest with you, EJ, I don't know if we're going to get a good answer today because Devontae Smith is inactive. It's a big question. It's going to be tough for them to rely on A.J. Brown, which brings us to, A.J. Brown just by himself, knowing that he's going to get doubled at points throughout the game, especially on high leverage downs. But let's talk about our player picks now. I'll let you go first, but I have some thoughts about how this passing game, or at least who I would be interested in keeping an eye on in today's game. But who have you got circled out there as this game goes on? Who will you be watching?
Yeah, I went with Cam Jurgens. I feel like, we talked about last week how the Eagles offensive line and the Rams defensive line both seem to be faring very well in the aftermath of a Hall of Famer retiring. And obviously Cam Jurgens has played at a really high level this season. But I do think that one thing that I'm interested to see from him today is, Michael Pierce, the Ravens gargantuan nose tackle, is coming off of injured reserve. He's 6 foot, 355 pounds. He is the type of nose tackle that I think should be able to give a guy like Cam Jurgens trouble. He just outweighs Cam Jurgens by so much. Obviously, we see Cam Jurgens match up against Jordan Davis a lot, during training camp. But this is one of the matchups that I think is going to be really important in the game. If the Eagles are able to, sorry, Pierce is out today. I apologize, but still, this Ravens defensive line is very stout up front, especially on the interior. So I think that it's going to be a tough matchup for him. If they are able to run the ball, I think it's because he will be having a good game, and if they're not, I think that's going to be a big factor in it.
All right, I teased a little bit what I was thinking for my player pick. Dallas Goedert is someone I'm very intrigued to see if they are able to step up in today's game, simply because of the fact that Devontae Smith is out and A.J. Brown cannot do it all by himself, as much as the Eagles would love him to just be able to snare the ball all day long. Goedert, since his return to action, he dealt with an injury earlier this season. In the last 3 games, he has 11 receptions for 105 yards and 1 touchdown. His 9.55 yards per reception would be a career low right now in the last 3 games. So it's pretty notable. Ravens defense, that said, has really had a hard time, I would say, against tight ends and coverage. They have conceded 790 yards against tight ends, and they have also conceded 72 receptions. Both of those would rank 3rd in the league. So if the Ravens continue on this trajectory of struggling against tight ends, perhaps Dallas Goedert can get going and try to build some momentum, step up in the absence of Devontae Smith. That would really help this Eagles passing game tremendously. All right, EJ, it is time for our second favorite part of of our show, and pulling out the crystal ball, looking into the future and making your prediction. I will speak for myself, but I have a feeling you felt similarly this week. This was not an easy prediction to make. Two fantastic teams that have been having great seasons, two great running backs, two fairly good defenses, two great quarterbacks, a lot to like on both sides of the ball. However, because of our jobs, we have to make one pick. And EJ, what was your final score prediction for today's game and why?
Yeah, I appreciate you qualifying that for me because I do. I mean, I could talk in circles about these are two really good teams. I could see this game going a lot of ways. I think I wrote in my prediction that if these two teams played each other 10 times in the regular season, for the record, obviously we were already at M&T Bank Stadium for the preseason to see Kenny Pickett and Josh Johnson face off. But yeah, if you see the two teams at full strength 10 times, I think that one team probably wins 6 of them. The other team probably wins 4. So I could see it going either way. I have the Eagles winning 31-28, mostly because I picked against the Eagles last week and I was wrong. So I'm at the point in the season where, I'm not going to bet again, or I'm not going to pick against the winning streak until they give me a real reason not to. So that was mostly the rationale for me. Like I said, I had the Eagles 31-28.
All right. I am taking the opposite victor in today's game. I'm going Ravens 24-23. I think this is my most narrow margin of the season, just by 1 point. We'll see how it shakes out. But as we've discussed at length throughout the show, these are two very good teams, a lot of strength on strength in many matchups across the board. However, the number one thing putting me over the edge for the Ravens for today's game is the fact that the Eagles are missing some incredibly important players on both sides of the ball in Devontae Smith and in Darius Slay. I think it's a big question, really. Will Isaiah Rodgers be able to fill in adequately for Slay? Will the depth receivers, even Dallas Goedert, be able to step up and fill in the shoes for Devontae Smith if Jalen Hurts needs to rely a little bit more on the passing game to get things done and Barkley isn't able to get going on the ground? So a lot of questions, I think more question marks on the side of the Eagles, which is why I'm going with the Ravens. However, as if I could cop out as I do every single week, it really feels like this one could be a coin flip too. So we'll see how everything shakes out. All right, everyone, that is going to do it for us today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Inquirer Live at Gameday Central. Just as a reminder, you can head on over to inquirer.com/Eagles Game Day, and we will be interacting with you throughout the game, taking your questions, whatever you've got on your mind. We'd love to see you over there in just a little bit.
And be sure to keep up with more Eagles coverage on the Uncovering the Birds podcast from our colleague Jeff McClain. New episodes will be released every week. Listen to wherever you get your podcasts, or you can go to inquirer.com/podcasts.
Once again, that is all for today. Thanks so much for tuning into Gameday Central, and we'll see you next time. Tom Valente, Marisol, Reiner, and Dan Horowitz.